Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. My name is Sabra Lane. I am the club's president. I'm also the presenter of the ABC radio program AM. Our guest today would normally be putting the finishing touches on a budget, but not this year. Josh Frydenberg instead will be preparing to give an economic statement to Parliament next week as it considers a crucial legislation over the COVID-19 Safe app. He's here today to give us an outline of the government's thinking about the way out of the crisis, and we thank you for coming to the club today. The club, I've got my colleagues here, but it's not a normal press club. We haven't packed the place out. We're observing restrictions, social distancing, so we'll still allow the same questioning that we expect, robust questioning of the Treasurer today. If you're following us online, you'll find us on Twitter. Our user handle is @PressClubAUST. Please welcome the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg.
Well, thanks very much, Sabra. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, my parliamentary colleagues, particularly Assistant Minister Senator Jane Hume. Thank you for being here. And maybe this is a good distance between politicians and journalists in this new environment. It was the weekend of the 22nd of February at the G20 Finance Ministers meeting in Saudi Arabia when the economic impact of the coronavirus really hit home. As I listened to my counterparts provide their country updates, it was the words of my Singaporean colleague that resonated most. He spoke of the damage inflicted on his proud city-state as a result of COVID-19 and the fiscal support that would now be required. Having not run a budget deficit in more than a decade, he was resigned to this fate. My mind quickly turned to what would be required at home. But even then, the scale of what we would confront was little known. In Australia, we had our first coronavirus case about a month earlier. And on the 1st of February, we were among the first countries to close our borders to foreigners who had been in mainland China in the last 14 days. We knew the economic impact would be greater than SARS, but this was mainly due to the fact that the Chinese economy was now 4 times bigger than it was back in 2003, and that Australia and the global economy were a lot more integrated with China. Even as recently as February, just 10 weeks ago, the IMF was saying that the coronavirus would detract only 0.1 percentage points from the anticipated global growth of more than 3%. There was growing economic uncertainty for Australia, but beyond the immediate impacts on international students and tourists, it was hard to assess, let alone to quantify, the downside risks. At this point, the government, through the strong and decisive leadership of the Prime Minister, was moving quickly on the health front. The Commonwealth's Chief Medical Officer declared COVID-19's pandemic potential more than a month ahead of the World Health Organisation's formal declaration. We had also initiated the Coronavirus Emergency Response Plan on the 27th of February. This was followed by a $2.4 billion health package on the 11th of March. On the 12th of March, the government announced its first $17.6 billion stimulus support package, at the time designed to provide targeted stimulus support to the economy in the face of the emerging economic shock. However, it was the announcement on the 15th of March of the first social distancing rules by the newly formed National Cabinet which both accelerated and broadened the economic impact. The next day, the ASX, the Australian Stock Exchange Index, fell by 9.7%, beating the largest daily fall seen in the global financial crisis of 8.3% in October 2008. it was clear that the economic environment was deteriorating rapidly, and government support beyond our first package would be required. School closures would follow. It was Treasury's estimate at the time that the macroeconomic impact from closing schools and childcare centres for 3 months could reduce GDP by around $34 billion or 7% for a quarter. This was based on the assessment that school and childcare closures could result in around 1 million adults needing to withdraw from the workforce to care for children at home. This illustrated the potential economic impact that health restrictions could have. Not only was the real economy being adversely impacted by COVID-19, but so too was the stability of the global financial system. Credit spreads had widened, and the ASX had lost a third of its value in just 4 weeks. We were in, and I quote, a very serious situation, in the words of the Reserve Bank Governor, Phil Lowe. It was against this backdrop that on the 19th of March, the Reserve Bank Board met out of cycle, a rare occurrence, to approve a massive $90 billion injection to boost the liquidity of the banks and encourage lending to small business. It was announced concurrently with a 25 basis point rate cut, which saw the cash rate fall to 0.25%, the lowest on record. The Morrison government was closely coordinating its actions with the Reserve Bank, announcing on the same day a $15 billion fund for smaller lenders through the Australian Office of Financial Management. Standard & Poor's described the announcements from the government and the Reserve Bank as decisive and coordinated action. Just 3 days later, on the 22nd of March, our second support package at $66 billion was announced. More than 3 times larger than the first package, it was targeted at cushioning the blow for those impacted households and businesses. This was a Team Australia moment and showed the government was prepared to do what it takes. Our message to Australians was we have got their back. Over the course of the next week, the number of coronavirus cases internationally continued to skyrocket, traversing from mainland Europe across the Channel to the United Kingdom, which had now moved to full lockdown. In Australia, states including Western Australia, South Australia and Queensland had closed their borders. Long queues formed outside Centrelink. This was hard to watch and something I will never forget. The number of people contracting coronavirus was increasing by more than 20% per day, and we were in a race against time to replenish our PPE stocks, increase the capacity of our ICU units, and secure a sufficient number of ventilators to deal with the expected surge in demand. It was all in this week that elective non-urgent surgery was suspended. With the second package effectively doubling the safety net with the $550 a fortnight coronavirus supplement and providing an expanded $32 billion cash flow boost to small businesses, our attention turned to putting in place a complementary wage subsidy program as the next stage in our economic response. Treasury had earlier advised me of the limitations of the United Kingdom government's wage subsidy program, and we had seen the 2-tier approach adopted in New Zealand. Having considered the alternatives, we came up with what the Prime Minister has described as a distinctly Australian model, announcing the new JobKeeper payment on the 30th of March. it would be a flat $1,500 fortnightly payment, equivalent to about 70% of the median wage, which would see every eligible worker, be they part-time, full-time, long-term, casual or sole trader, receive the same amount and apply irrespective of whether they had been stood down or were still in work. Using existing payroll systems, JobKeeper had the benefit of keeping employers and employees formally connected while reducing the cost of labour to employers, thus helping to keep their businesses in business. As with each of the economic measures announced in response to COVID-19, JobKeeper is temporary, it's targeted and leverages our existing systems. At $130 billion, there are some that say JobKeeper is too costly, while others say it has not gone far enough and needs to be expanded. The reality is we needed a program that was equivalent to the scale of the shock, and JobKeeper was it. As John Howard had said to me in the days before the package was announced, in times of crisis, there are no ideological constraints. Our decision around JobKeeper was made in the context of the new social distancing arrangements announced following the National Cabinet on Tuesday the 24th of March. This would see the prohibition of a number of activities and precipitate the temporary closure of a number of businesses, including pubs, restaurants and cafes. At that time, Treasury could see a scenario where GDP could fall by 10 to 12% in the June quarter. If these restrictions were increased even further, akin to the 8-week lockdown in Europe, then the adverse economic impact on GDP would double to 24% or $120 billion in the June quarter. This would have seen enormous stress on our financial system as a result of increased balance sheet impairments, widespread firm closures, higher unemployment and higher household debt. This was the cliff we were standing on. The potential economic consequences of the pandemic were immense. Treasury's advice underlined the economic imperative that produced the JobKeeper program. In dealing with the virus, we are fortunate that through decisive, early and coordinated action, Australia has made strong progress in flattening the curve. With one of the highest testing rates and lowest mortality rates in the world, we have seen the growth in the number of coronavirus cases go from more than 20% per day just a few weeks ago to less than 0.5% today. Tragically, 96 people have died in Australia from the coronavirus, accounting for around 0.04% of total global casualties. Adjusting for population, the death toll in the United Kingdom is over 110 times of that here in Australia. In France, it is over 100 times. And in the United States, it is over 50 times. At almost 70,000, the US death toll is extraordinary when one considers the first casualty in the United States from coronavirus was only around 2 months ago on the 29th of February. Some observers claim that the Swedish model of handling the virus with significantly less restrictions is the model of success. Respectfully, I disagree. Sweden has 40% of Australia's population, but 70 times the death rate. The numbers speak for themselves. Notwithstanding Australia's progress to date on the health front and the unprecedented scale and scope of our economic response, our economic indicators are going to get considerably worse in the period ahead before they get better. Some of the hardest hit sectors like retail and hospitality are among the biggest employers, accounting for more than 2 million employees between them. Recent credit and debit card data from the banks show that spending on arts and recreational services was down 60%, and accommodation and food services were down around 70% in late April compared to the previous year. Despite the rush for toilet paper and the record increase in overall retail trade in March, due in no small part to panic buying, overall consumption, according to NAB data, has fallen 19.5% since the start of the year, with declines across all jurisdictions. Victoria has had the steepest fall of 23%, followed by the ACT, Western Australia, New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Northern Territory and Tasmania. The economic shock will be broad. GDP is expected to fall significantly, with Treasury forecasting a fall of over 10% in the June quarter, equivalent to $50 billion. This takes into account an anticipated reduction of around a third this year in net overseas migration. The forecast fall in GDP, together with the employment effects of the health restrictions, have seen Treasury forecast that the unemployment rate is likely to double. Having fallen in February to 5.1%, it is now forecast to reach 10% in the June quarter. Treasury have also forecast that but for the JobKeeper program, it could have risen to 15%. The worsening economic picture is not unique to Australia. Indeed, many countries are facing considerably more challenging circumstances. More than $8 trillion has already been committed globally in economic support, with more than 100 countries going to the IMF seeking assistance. The economic shock of the world dwarfs what we have seen during the GFC. During the GFC, the global economy contracted by just 0.1% in 2009. But according to the International Monetary Fund's most recent forecast, there will be a 3% contraction in global growth in 2020. In the last 4 weeks alone, 30 million Americans have filed jobless claims, which is equivalent to almost 19% of their workforce. The extraordinary cost of responding to the crisis is illustrated by the US Treasury announcement overnight that the government plans to issue $3 trillion in debt in the 3 months to June, which is almost 5 times what was raised over the 3 months during the GFC and more than twice what was raised by the United States in all of last year. China's economy has also been hit hard, with GDP falling by 9.8% in the March quarter, the first quarterly drop on record. In Italy, France and Spain, they have also seen the largest GDP quarterly falls on record. As we cross the bridge to recovery, Australia has the advantage of having made real progress in suppressing the spread of the virus without having to resort to a full lockdown, as has been the case with other nations. Significant sectors of our economy, like agriculture, mining and construction, have been able to adapt to the new health restrictions and in most cases continue to operate. This is demonstrated by the ABS survey showing 85% of mining businesses were still operating. Reassuringly, National Cabinet has signalled that from this Friday it will assess more opportunities for easing restrictions, building on decisions already taken to date, such as around elective surgery or in some states limited gatherings and visitations. The health advice of the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee, AHPPC, is that 15 conditions precedent need to be satisfied before the easing of restrictions can be considered. These restrictions and their conditions relate to the resourcing and data analysis around testing and tracing, as well as health system capacity, including the availability of masks, gowns, gloves and ventilators. Importantly, Australia is on track to meet 11 of those 15 conditions, with progress on the remaining 4 being expedited by governments. The continued take-up of the COVID Safe app, which allows people to be notified earlier if they have been in contact with a confirmed case, will protect them and their loved ones. This app, which is approaching 5 million downloads, is also a compelling technological development in our suppression strategy. As has been characteristic of our response to this crisis, we will continue to be guided by the expert health advice and seek to ease restrictions in a way that minimises the health risk and maximises economic activity. There are some sectors of the economy that are not only significant contributors to employment and output in their own right, but are also important enablers for the broader economy. Early childhood and school education, because of their impact on the labour force, and transport and logistics, because of their impact on supply chains, are cases in point. Going forward, we need to ensure when sectors are open, for example in retail, that there is both consumer confidence to engage in these activities, but also business confidence that they are unlikely to be disrupted again and forced to close. When businesses reopen after a forced hiatus, many have to restock, absorbing their remaining working capital. This reinforces the need of having the right processes and protocols in place to manage the health risk and provide for a safe working environment. At the same time, businesses need to have confidence in the broader health response that is keeping the economy open. This is why progress against those 15 conditions precedent are so important. It is about having confidence that as we enable more economic activity to take place, we can effectively manage any health risks that arise. It is also why every Australian that wants to get back to work and every business owner that wants to open their doors again should download the COVID Safe app. We must get people back into jobs and we must get people back at work. For every extra week that the current restrictions remain in place, Treasury estimate that close to $4 billion will be reduced in economic activity from a combination of a reduced workforce participation, reduced productivity and reduced consumption. This is equivalent to around what 4 million Australians on the median wage would earn in a week. I repeat, the $4 billion that we lose in economic activity for every additional week that these restrictions are in place, we lose the equivalent of to what 4 million Australians on the median wage would earn in a week. History shows that the longer people are unemployed, the harder it is to get a job. In the early 1990s, the unemployment rate increased by 5 percentage points over 3 years, but took 7 years to get back to its pre-crisis level. As has been remarked, unemployment went up the elevator and came down the stairs. In the current coronavirus crisis, it is expected that the unemployment rate will go up by around 5 percentage points in just 3 months, let alone in 3 years. It underlines the importance of getting people back to work as soon as possible to avoid the long-term economic and social impacts from high unemployment. Throughout this health crisis, it has been a fundamental priority for the Morrison government to keep the economy going, even with the disruption and constraints caused by the health restrictions. We have made over 80 regulatory changes designed to provide greater flexibility for businesses and individuals to operate. This has included changes to bankruptcy and insolvency laws to create a regulatory shield at a time of financial stress, clarification of responsible lending laws to improve the flow of credit to small business, and an expansion of telehealth rebates to promote remote consultations, which could have otherwise been impossible due to social distancing restrictions. Consistent with this approach, we will also be amending the Corporations Act to provide for virtual AGMs and the electronic execution of documents by company officers for a 6-month period. It is this flexible and nimble approach to our regulatory frameworks that we will need to take forward into the recovery phase. Through these and the many other economic and health measures we have announced over recent weeks, Australia now has a bridge to the other side. The combination of our cash flow boost to small and medium-sized businesses, early and tax-free access to superannuation, $750 cash payments to more than 6 million Australians on income support, have already seen more than $20 billion flowed into the economy in recent weeks. Another $30 billion is expected to flow into the economy over the next month. More than 725,000 businesses employing more than 4.7 million Australians have formally registered for JobKeeper and will start to receive their payments this week. The ABS reported yesterday that its recent survey found that nearly half the businesses to be supported by JobKeeper said the announcement of the program had positively influenced them to retain their staff. I, like my colleagues, have been contacted by so many small business owners, from the local hairdresser to the local cafe, indicating that JobKeeper has made all the difference, enabling them to keep their lights on and their staff employed. Together with our small and medium-sized enterprise loan guarantee in partnership with the banks, which has now already seen around $1 billion approved by the banks, the government is providing an extraordinary level of support to this vital sector of our economy, a level of support the country has never seen before. We are by no means out of this crisis, and we must be realistic that even with the best medical minds focused on finding a vaccine, it remains elusive. Nevertheless, as we build to the recovery phase, we must also turn our mind to the changes that will be needed to further drive economic growth and employment. In the world post-crisis, we must continue on our path to a more efficient and productive economy. At the end of last year, economic growth was strengthening, with the International Monetary Fund forecasting Australia to grow faster than the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Japan and the United States. Employment growth in Australia was nearly double the OECD average, with participation rates near record highs and more than 1.5 million new jobs being created since we came to government. We'd also delivered the largest personal income tax cuts in 20 years, providing immediate relief to more than 10 million Australians. By abolishing an entire tax bracket and protecting against bracket creep, once fully implemented, these changes will mean 94% of Australians pay no more than 30 cents in the dollar on every dollar they earn. At the same time, the budget was back in balance for the first time in 11 years, and even with the global headwinds created by the trade tensions and the adverse economic impacts of the drought and fires, we were still on track to deliver Australia's first budget surplus in 12 years. In the words of the Reserve Bank Governor Phil Lowe on the 5th of February, Australia's economic fundamentals remain very strong. Responsible economic management, which has seen our net debt to GDP entering this crisis at around a quarter of that in the United States and the United Kingdom and 1/7 of that in Japan, has given Australia the financial capacity to respond to this crisis in a way that many other nations could not. Our direct financial support, including a number of demand-driven programs, carries a price tag of around $200 billion or 10% of GDP. The income shock caused by this crisis will also hit the revenue side. the totality of which will be quantified in budget in October. Despite these financial impacts, our balance sheet remains strong, with Standard & Poor's saying less than 4 weeks ago that while the government's fiscal measures will weigh heavily on public finances in the immediate future, they won't structurally weaken Australia's fiscal position. Our ability to handle this crisis has once again reminded Australians of the importance of a strong and stable financial position. It is an emphatic rejection of the claims by some that our focus on restoring the nation's finances were merely an ideological pursuit. It is self-evident that putting the country in a strong financial position must always be a primary responsibility of government. After the crisis is resolved, Australia will face a higher debt burden that will take many years to repay. The proven path for paying back debt is not through higher taxes, which curtails aspiration and investment, but by growing the economy with productivity-enhancing reforms. We know that a strong economy is the foundation for everything else, and only with a strong economy can you provide the health, education and essential services that Australians rely on. The economy today is 16% larger than when we came to government, and our task ahead is to grow it even further. As the Prime Minister has indicated, we're not about to announce a shopping list of reforms. We are in a harvesting phase during which we will look at new and old reform proposals with fresh eyes. In sifting through these reform options, our focus will be on a practical solution to the most significant challenges which we will confront post the crisis. Reskilling those who may have lost their jobs, upskilling those in existing jobs to adapt to the enhanced digital and e-commerce environment, and equipping those entering the workforce for the first time with the skills they need to get a job. New infrastructure projects, big and small, to ensure our $100 billion 10-year pipeline is maintained. Regulatory reform to reduce the cost burden on business and the economy, enhance the flow of capital and increase competition and build on existing initiatives like the consumer data right. Tax and industrial relations reform as a means of increasing our competitiveness, cognizant of the fact that in the aftermath of this crisis there will be less aggregate demand domestically and internationally, which will see heightened competition for goods and services across all markets. The values and the principles that have guided the coalition reforms in the past must guide us again in the future. Encouraging personal responsibility, maximising personal choice, rewarding effort and risk-taking while ensuring a safety net which is underpinned by a sense of decency and fairness. Unleashing the power of dynamic, innovative and open markets must be central to the recovery, with the private sector leading job creation, not government. There is a risk that protectionist sentiment re-emerges on the other side of the crisis, and for that we must be vigilant. While we must always safeguard our national interest, we must also recognise the great benefits that have accrued to Australia as a trading nation. In conclusion, this crisis has seen the very best of Australia and Australians. From our brave healthcare professionals working tirelessly on the front line, to the public at large who have heeded the advice, our nation is now in a position envied by many. Effective cooperation through the National Cabinet, guided by expert health and economic advice, has given rise to a unity of purpose across geographical and political lines usually reserved only for wartime. Stakeholders representing employers and employees alike have come together with government in support of practical solutions which not only leave us well placed for the recovery, but creates opportunities to work together in the future. while the shadow of the economic shock created by this crisis will be both profound and long-lasting, we can remain optimistic about our future. And it is with that that I will give the final word to one of my constituents, Enid Williamson. Just 3 months shy of her 100th birthday, Enid recently wrote to me as follows. Here in Australia, we have always found ways and means of growing and responding to life's difficulties. When this corona pandemic is under control, I believe we will be like a phoenix rising from the ashes, and with our innate resilience become stronger, hopefully more caring, hopefully more integrated, hopefully more cooperative in achieving a better community and a better world. Just a dream? Yes, but don't just follow that dream, chase it. Thank you, Enid. That is all what we must do. Thank you.
Thank you, Treasurer. How flexible is the government prepared to be with further financial assistance, given with winter approaching, the experts warned that there will be more outbreaks of COVID-19 and a second wave?
Well, Sabra, obviously we'll continue to do what is necessary. That's been our consistent position through this crisis, and where there is a demand, we will be there to support the Australian people. But as you know, we've already outlined some $320 billion worth of economic support, which equates to over 16% of GDP, $200 billion of which is direct support. The other support is through loans and guarantees and support for the financial system. That is a very significant amount by global standards, and in the case of Australia's history, the most that we've ever seen. So we're now in the implementation phase of our programs. The JobKeeper program has seen over 725,000 businesses register. More than 4.7 million Australian workers will be covered by that program. That money will be flowing out this week. I believe that that support, together with our other programs, will be what is required to continue to help people through this crisis.
I remind my colleagues, one question per person. Shane Wright.
Thanks, Sarah. Shane Wright from the AHO for the Sydney Treasurer. It's no secret that immigration has been pivotal to Australia's economic success over the last 30 years. The Prime Minister mentioned last week that the forecast for 2021 is an 85% fall in non. How will that affect your economic recovery plans, and does it mean that you have to actually start looking at ways to encourage more people back into the country post-virus?
Well, Australia is very proud of the fact that we have welcomed immigrants, and I am a product of it. Indeed, everyone here is in one way or another. And I think that will continue to be our approach. But you're right, it will affect the economy. And as long as the borders are closed, obviously the movement to Australia of international students and as well permanent migrants, it will be restricted, and that is a fact that not only Australia but many other countries will be going through. But you're right, it will have a significant impact on the economy, but we have allowed for that in our forecasts.
Michelle Grattan.
Michelle Grattan of The Conversation. Treasurer, do you think that the crisis has exposed significant problems with Australia's supply chains and their vulnerabilities? If you do think that, how do you think it should be addressed, whether by diversifying sources, becoming more self-sufficient, and how do we avoid protectionism in this process?
Well, there is already work going on this particular issue undertaken by Treasury, the Department of Industry, and indeed the COVID Commission under Nev Power. There are some areas, Michelle, where we are self-sufficient. We're a country of 25 million people, but we produce enough food for 75 million people. There are other areas where we've shown to be, where we show that we need more work, and I'm thinking particularly about the rush to get some of this PPE equipment and other manufactured goods in the health space, which we had to rely on many ways and means in order to secure that. So these are questions that we will address in the aftermath, but we're already the aftermath of this crisis, but we're already undertaking the thinking around. But the Prime Minister has made very clear we've got to play to our strengths. We've got to play to our comparative advantages. And that does not mean we produce everything or need to produce everything in this country, but we do need to ensure that in areas where there are going to be materials that could be absolutely necessary in times of crisis, that we won't be left vulnerable to disrupted supply chains. An area where we have already taken some action is fuel security. As you know, Australia's fuel stocks are below where we'd like them to be, and the Minister's been working on securing extra supplies. But again, storage of those supplies, or more storage of those supplies into the future may be required.
Andrew Probyn.
Treasurer Andrew Probyn from the ABC. Some ABS stats came out today showing that something like 1 million people lost their job between March 14 and April 18. Given that you did increase JobSeeker well above New Start, and given the fact that you're saying that unemployment in previous recessions went up in a lift and came down in the stairs, are you seriously putting to the nation that the JobSeeker payment, the higher JobSeeker payment, will return to the rather measly New Start levels once the 6-month period is up?
Well, we've been very clear that the measures we've announced are temporary, they're targeted, they're proportionate, and we've used existing systems. These were the principles that we adopted. That ABS data you referred to is pretty consistent with where Treasury's forecasts are for unemployment to hit 10% in the June quarter, to rise from that 5.1% we saw in February and 5.2% we saw in March. But we're very conscious, Andrew, that the way to get people off the unemployment benefits is to get them back into the workforce, to encourage economic activity, and that's why the lifting of the restrictions are so important. The quicker we lift those restrictions, the more economic activity we generate. Those enablers that I was talking about, those sectors, education, childcare, transport and logistics, even opening our cafes and restaurants will mean that farmers will have a home for their produce. And we've actually now seen rains in recent weeks and months that is making a real difference to the capacity of the farmers to produce more from their land. And so we need to find a home for that produce, and getting those cafes and restaurants and other activities open as quickly as possible will be a way of getting more people back into work and reducing that unemployment.
Is that a long way of saying yes, it's going to go back to the New Start level?
Well, we've been very clear that these measures are temporary, and the JobSeeker supplement at $550 was temporary.
Tom Connell.
Tom Connell from Sky News. You mentioned there the ratings agencies. Obviously, our previous path towards a surplus and paying off debt is gone. Are you working towards setting any sort of limit in terms of debt to GDP? What will you be guided by, or if not, why not?
Well, in terms of debt to GDP, we entered this crisis with debt to GDP around 20%. And that was a quarter of what was in the US and the UK, and as I said in the speech, a seventh of what it was in Japan. That has given us a capacity to respond without some of the burdens that other countries have had going into this crisis. We believe that living within our means is going to be critically important. Before this crisis, our interest bill on our debt was around $19 billion a year. That is about as much as we spend on schools, double what we spend on childcare. So every time you lift your debt and you increase your interest payments, that is money that has to be found across the economy. So we have set we've got a limit in terms of what is legislated through the Parliament. That's $850 billion. Obviously, we're working hard to keep it well below that. But what we're focused on right now is spending the money where it is necessary to avoid some of the challenges that we've seen around the rest of the world.
Patrick Cummins.
Patrick Cummins from The Australian. My question goes to the post-COVID economic recovery effort and the reform effort. Given a budget deficit that some expect to run into the hundreds of billions, are we able to afford company tax rates as part of that reform effort, or bring forward household income tax cuts?
Well, the first thing to say is, as a government, we've always looked for opportunities to cut taxes, and you refer to personal income tax cuts, which, if you combine the last two budgets, that's $300 billion worth of tax cuts. And what is important is that we have returned a bit of the bracket creep, and we're ensuring now we've got a flattened, simpler system so that 94% of taxpayers will pay no more than 30 cents in the dollar. One big tax bracket between $45,000 and $200,000. When it comes to company tax, I've said before, I think that the rate here in Australia is uncompetitive. We have cut SME company tax cuts, company tax rate legislated down to 25%, but you've also got larger companies that are paying a higher rate. We did announce in the first package an accelerated depreciation initiative, which would see businesses with a turnover up to $500 million be assisted with a 50% accelerated depreciation. That's an added benefit to some of those bigger companies. But at 30 cents in the dollar here in Australia for larger companies, 21 cents in the dollar in the United States, 19 cents in the dollar in the United Kingdom, and 17 cents in the dollar in Singapore, Australia has now the second highest company tax rate to Portugal in the OECD. That is a reversal of the position we were when we got the 30 cents in the dollar. So, look, we're not in the rule-in, rule-out game. What we are doing, though, is looking at how can we continue to compete for capital. And tax rates, like flexible workplaces, like infrastructure, like deregulation, they're all key factors that businesses consider when they establish their businesses around the world, but also when they decide to hire more people. Capital is mobile, business is not very sentimental, and so we have to ensure we have the most competitive environment possible.
Phil Curry.
Phil Curry from the AFR. You and the Prime Minister have outlined your guiding principles for the economic recovery. You know, like keep the tax burden low, industrial relations, deregulation. What about spending restraint? Is it likely you're going to have to cut spending where you can, and in that context, will there be any revisitation of the Audit Commission, which was prepared for the Abbott government and not really acted on?
We're not cutting services. In fact, we've been spending more on essential services, and that has been a direct product fill of responsible economic management. Because at the same time that we inherited a $48 billion deficit and turned it into a balanced budget, we increased health spending and education spending to record levels. And obviously we're rolling out the National Disability Insurance Scheme as well, which is a major bipartisan and important initiative for the country. So we've been able to spend more money in those essential services areas, list more drugs on the PBS, and at the same time bring the budget back into balance. It's that fiscal discipline, it's that spending restraint by reducing the spending, the wasteful spending, that is going to be really important into the future.
Mark Riley.
Treasurer Mark Riley from the Seven Network. Some of your state Treasurer colleagues are talking about some significant reform, removing stamp duties or reducing them, and payroll taxes. It's pretty obvious they're going to be coming to you and talking about the GST to compensate for that. Is your message going to be that there'll be no discussion on the GST rate and that they'll have to find other ways of compensating for those lost revenues, accepting that it's about 30% of their state revenues through stamp duties alone?
Well, you're right that stamp duty is, one of the largest, if not in some states the largest source of revenue for them. And I also point out that the that the Productivity Commission in Shifting the Dial report, Mark, referred to the fact that stamp duties reduce mobility because it's effectively a transaction tax, reduce mobility and also increase house prices. So I congratulate the state governments, and this is efforts being led by New South Wales and Victoria on the work that they are doing. But when it comes to these state taxes and the state tax mix, these are very much in their domain. We'll continue to have discussions with them about a whole range of issues. We're meeting as treasurers every week, and certainly in the case of Tim Pallas and Dominic Perrottet, it's a very productive relationship about a whole range of issues.
Peter Van Onselen.
Peter Van Onselen from Network 10. Treasurer, you made the very cogent point that historically in a crisis when the unemployment rate goes up fast, it takes a very long time to come down. Given that the ABS data that we've seen referred to today shows that most of the industries where the unemployment is spiking are industries that employ people who are not eligible for the JobKeeper payment, will you take personal responsibility in the years to come if it takes a long time for that unemployment rate to fall?
Well, obviously I disagree with your assumption there. I mean, in some of these higher employing sectors, there are a lot of casuals who have been there for 12 months or more. There's a lot of part-time workers. There are a lot of full-time workers, and all of those are eligible for the JobKeeper payment, predicated on the fact that their employer has seen a reduction in their turnover. This program, which Treasury estimate will see 6 million workers benefit from, is extraordinary in its scale and its scope. We accepted a definition which is established in the Fair Work Act as to what is a long-term casual, and we applied that. It's also important to understand that we're providing the job seeker payment of $1,100 a fortnight, which is available to some of those people who weren't able to access the JobKeeper payment if they were in that category. But what we have sought to do is maintain that formal relationship between the employer and employee through this crisis, even if that worker is stood down, because that's going to encourage and make it easier to have that bounce back on the other side.
Catherine Murphy.
Catherine Murphy from Guardian Australia. Treasurer, in April 2018, standing where you are right now, you told this club that Australia needed to find sensible, workable, affordable, market-based solutions to transition to a low-emissions future. Furthermore, you said the alternative would be policy paralysis, more expensive short-term government interventions and higher power prices. Now, today one of Australia's largest business groups, the AI Group, has said that the two biggest challenges currently before us are the COVID recovery and also achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Are they right?
Well, in terms of meeting emissions reduction targets that Australia signed up on to, that is very much a focus of the Morrison government. We've made great progress on that. At the same time, we're investing in new generation in the energy space, and we've been following the ACCC's recommendations about more transparency and competition in the retail and the wholesale market. I think all of those interventions, while coalition governments don't really like to make those sort of regulatory interventions, I think they've been necessary in that sector. So we believe that those changes we've made on the generation side, on the regulatory side, are helping to reduce prices, but also to reduce our carbon footprint.
Katina Curtis.
Treasurer, Katina Curtis from AAP. We've got a generation now facing the possibility of long-term joblessness, and another generation coming up behind them facing possible poorer education outcomes because they've been learning at home, and the probability that they're going to find it harder to get a job after they've been to uni or done training. How is Australia not going to avoid taking a hit to our productivity and hence our growth in the future?
Well, you touch on an important area in terms of skills and getting people back into the workforce, and one of the comments that's come through regularly in my dialogue with businesses big and small is that through this crisis there's going to be greater digital take-up across the economy. It was already a transition that was occurring, but more people working from home, more people having the virtual meetings. E-commerce is going to accelerate in this post-crisis environment, and it's going to be important that young and old workers have access to those skills. So the Joyce review was the one we commissioned in terms of the skill space, setting up a National Skills Commission, working with the states on the issue of TAFE in particular, but also accreditation. I mean, accreditation of skills is one of the recommendations out of the Shifting the Dial report, which was raised in the conversation with state treasurers last week. So there's work that's being undertaken across jurisdictional lines in order to try to get that. Those skills and those accreditation changes to enhance the economy, and it is one area among many that we will be focused on for reform once we get through this crisis.
Mark Kenny.
Treasurer Mark Kenny from the National Press Club Board and also ANU. You talked about the cliff that you were facing, or we were facing, when you considered the JobKeeper program. There's another cliff coming, of course, when that ends in October. Will you consider any sort of transitional programs, perhaps innovative thinking like income contingent or revenue contingent loans that would provide liquidity in the economy but not appear on the liability side of the budget?
Well, in terms of loans, as you know, we announced a $40 billion program with the banks where we would co-guarantee 50-50 loans to small and medium-sized businesses of up to $250,000 for 3 years. And we would also ensure that there was no interest payments that were required in those first 6 months. So we have some of those programs. But I think, Mark, you make an important point, which is as we come out of this crisis, there are going to be sectors of the economy that are going to come out more slowly than others. And this is an issue that the government is thinking about. For example, you're going to have travel restrictions in place on international borders longer than you're going to have domestic restrictions in place. So that's obviously going to have a real impact on tourism, for example. And one of the imperatives of getting domestic flights going again, once the suppression strategy is really taken hold, and obviously we've made great progress on that, is that we can get the domestic tourism markets going, as well as the freight task. So there are going to be sectors of the economy that are moving out of the crisis quicker than others. I'm very pleased that through this crisis, construction and to a degree manufacturing have been going strongly. The other point I'd make is that Australia is increasingly a services-orientated economy. 70% of our economy is services. So when you're looking at the indexes of activity, you see a much bigger drop over this period in services, thinking hospitality, thinking accommodation, thinking tourism, than you are in manufacturing. And we have to think about smoothing that transition for businesses and for workers into that recovery phase, and that's the thinking that we have underway.
Lani Scarr.
Lani Scarr from the West Australian newspaper. Treasurer, you've spoken today about the fact that 85% of mining businesses were operating this month, essentially helping the economy to keep running. Will you categorically rule out any changes to revenue raising for the sector in the post-COVID rebuild?
Like I said earlier, Lani, our focus is on lower taxes where we have the opportunity to do so. That's our proven record. We weren't the party that went to any elections with a mining tax. We are very much focused on ensuring that sector gets the benefits that they need. We have a whole series of incentives in place to support the mining sector for companies big and small.
Treasurer, you're a little bit over in your speech. Are you happy to take a few more questions?
Sure.
Excellent. Tim Shaw.
Thanks, Barbara. Treasurer Tim Shaw, National Press Club Board. Can I just follow on from Mark and from Patrick's questions in a post-COVID economic environment? It's contradictory what you said today. We've got some of the highest company tax rates in the world, and yet we've got one of the lowest consumption taxes in the world. Have you and the state and territory treasurers talked specifically about the shortfall in their GST receipts based on $4 billion a week we're dropping at the moment. That's more than $400 million in GST. What, if any, discussions have those state and territory treasurers had with you regarding the GST?
Well, we just had the GST relativities confirmed following the advice of the independent assessor in that case, and obviously some states got more than they were hoping for, and some got less, and it's just swings and roundabouts. It moves from year to year. Some are happy and some would like more, but obviously the impact on GST is a reflection of the impact on consumption, and the quicker we can get people to work, the quicker we can get kids back to school. And I point out, South Australia, Western Australia, Northern Territory, around 70% of kids are back in school. That's a really positive thing, and New South Wales and Queensland have already signalled that they want kids back in school by the end of the month. That's a positive development because that will impact on the labour force. That will therefore have an impact on consumption, and that will obviously flow back to state coffers through the GST.
Claire Bickers.
Claire Bickers from the Adelaide Advertiser. Treasurer, my question goes to the restructuring on the other side of this. What sort of opportunities do you see for smaller states in growing their economy after this? What sort of silver linings are there in terms of, the industries or the avenues that they might look to regrow their economies?
Well, for example, in infrastructure, I think there's going to be a real demand for new projects, particularly to pick up some of the workers that may have lost their jobs in other sectors. I think that's going to be important. Education, particularly skills training, is going to be extremely important as well, and it adds much to our economy. Obviously, universities are going to have to focus on how to rebuild their market share after seeing the international student market drop off so significantly. There's going to be challenges in the tourism space, but I think there'll be opportunities across the economy. Certainly, the health sector is going to see a boon in terms of opportunities there in both innovation, research, development, but also in manufacturing. I think Michelle's question about global supply chains. I think that this will be a global conversation now about the reliability of some global supply chains, and I think that will create opportunities for niche manufacturers here in Australia and elsewhere to take on new production in areas that may have been previously offshore.
Matt Cranston.
Treasurer, much has been made of the enormous amount of government debt to GDP coming through. But household debt to GDP in Australia is twice that of the US. Yes, there's been obviously a big fiscal response from you guys. Interest rates are at record lows, and there's been some deferrals of interest as well. The question is, surely as Treasurer, you have some figures or some numbers in your head as to the capacity or the buffer that households have to handle that debt when it comes through in just a few months. That's what businesses want to know, that's what they want to get a grip on, is your understanding of what that buffer is.
Well, household debt will be a function in some degree by what happens on unemployment. People have a job, then they can meet their mortgage payments, and indeed there are other expenses. But as you know, household assets to household debt, household assets are about 4 to 5 times what household debt is. So there is a position here in Australia where we can get through these issues. The Governor of the Reserve Bank has previously commented on household debt and the issue, saying it's a manageable issue. And obviously we're very conscious, though, the best way to help household budgets is to get people into work.
Everybody, please join me in thanking the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg.